I've got 4 slides that I use real quick to summarize the 4 main problems that I see in claims. And these are pretty much the classical ones. They represent the vast majority of all the problems that you're going to see. I'm thinking that the most successful claims that I've seen have willing contributions from all the investigators. When the poor head of R&D has to write the descriptions at the end of the year, or 6 months after the end of the year, or whatever, they tend not to flow as well. People have left. You'd be surprised that the manager doesn't always know what all the team members are doing. So what I like is the manager to really direct the job and manage it at a high level, and then allow the researchers to talk about what he or she did, and then the manager should just be summarizing that to take the most significant parts and put it into the end description. Okay? That will allow them to provide conciseness and brevity, okay, which is what the candidate or revenue agent says is both the interest of the claimant and the agency itself. All right, so the 4 issues are: number 1, failure to find standard practice. So I recognize that with no square. So you've got, people doing really complicated things with different ideas, but at the same time I'm saying, well, where was your initial idea from? What gave you the starting point? Did you do any comparison to standard practice at all? And if not, that's going to show as a glaring error or weakness, and CRA was probably going to catch on that. Okay? Probably the most common reason is what they'll call it routine engineering. So we've seen that. Well, this is routine engineering. You have a really skilled person doing something that looks really complicated, but they know exactly what they're doing. And chances are they got it on the first try. They didn't even experiment. So it was a very complicated process, but they nailed it. So if you're nailing something on the first try without experiments, first question is, could this be seen as routine engineering? And how am I going to explain, going back, what my hypothesis was? Test. You can get lucky once in a while, but most people don't get lucky all the time. So you want to keep these in mind too when you're looking at these descriptions. Okay, activities beyond someone's qualifications. This is classic. I mean, I don't know how many clients I've had who've been successful in medicine or aerospace or something, and then every one of them at some point when they get bigger tries to do a software project. They try to design some software system. Just because you're skilled to do work in medicine doesn't make you skilled to do work in every field of science, okay? For every field of science you're claiming advancement, you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate skills. I mean, this is a great example I have of a client that I got on an objection or appeal who was basically a doctor, obstetrician, and this was probably around the turn of the 90s, so the internet wasn't really high speed yet, and he was trying to develop a method to take fax images of an ultrasound and do a diagnosis. And the goal was to do it within an hour while the patient was still at an outlying medical office. So a patient might be up in Barrie, and rather than having to come down to Toronto to see a specialist, they want to send a fax of the ultrasound, have the specialist look at it, and ask whatever questions he or she needed of the other doctor, general practitioner, to avoid that trip. But we didn't want to make the person wait more than an hour. So what they did was they looked at different compression technologies and 10 different ones, and which ones would allow the doctor to do it or not. And the claim initially got bounced because they claimed an advancement in computer science, which it wasn't. They were just trying different routines. But it actually was accepted overall because what it was an advancement in medicine. That when you looked at what was really happening, this doctor was looking at different ultrasounds and looking at things like color and whatever. And you say, well, ultrasound's black and white, but color actually is a medical term that they use for different kinds of shades and depths of veins or medical structures that they're looking for. And the question was, how much can we lose before we make a critical misdiagnosis, a life-threatening misdiagnosis? And that was an advancement in medicine. Okay? There was no standard practice on it. They didn't do that. So it fit all the criteria when claimed in the right field. So again, always be cognizant of what field. Every project says what field of science or technology are you making an advancement in, and then they're really going to hold you to that field. You can have multiple projects in multiple fields, but each project they're going to be looking at who's supervising that project, and does he or she have the requisite skills in that field of technology. Again, it's one of these things that sounds funny, but in practice I see it all the time because people get comfortable. Hey, I've got my claim for 8 years. I'm getting pretty confident. Let's start to push the boundaries a little bit. Okay, and that's usually where all the problems happen. Yes.
One of the field are very, very close. So bioinformatics, biochemistry. whether it's the computer engineering side that's being used, so you're developing factor algorithms to do X or proteins, or is it the biochemistry side? We're that close.
Yeah. So the question is, what if there's judgment? And this is often the case. What if there's several fields, 2 or 3 or 4 fields of science and technology? We've got multidisciplinary teams working on a project. I see this all the time. CRA's answer is you now have to use your professional judgment and pick the one that you think most represents the field. So the answer is you used to be able, up until about 8 years ago, you used to be able to pick multiple fields, and now the form allows you to pick one. And what they say is, use your judgment. The one that you think, have a vote, have a mutiny, whatever, pick one, and then you got to stick with it.
And if they have done a review and indicated that they'll count for informatics or the biochem or what have you, does that tend to stick over time, or is that just that one judgment of that RTA?
Well, so the question was, what if do RTAs appear to favor one field over another? I haven't actually seen that. I think they really focus on the science. Now, if an RTA has a background in one particular field, then that individual may, but that shouldn't really affect your documentation choice. You should go with the one that you think is best, because the RTAs turn over relatively quickly, right?
Could you also file 2 separate claims for the same project for the two different?
Okay, so another really good question. Could we split the project into more than one project? And the answer is absolutely you can. The government does not tell you how to structure your project. They basically say it could be product-based or process-based, right? Very often I do the opposite. I see someone develop 2 or 3 different products, where the first one looks really good, but then when I'm reading the second and third one, I'm like, this just looks like the first one all over again. Why don't we take those 3 products and talk about the process? The one project is the process to develop all of these products within that process. And what we learned, and that's usually the more correct way to do it, because that's where the technological advancement was. That the advancement was usually great on the first one, and then there were smaller little ones. Again, and to avoid the redundancy or things like that, or confusion that we're claiming the same thing 3 times, we can package that. Or we can split it out. So the answer is yes. They don't tell you how to write a project. It could be product-based, or it could be process-based. New product, new process, improved product, improved process. You can pick. All right. And lastly, never use the words trial and error. CRA defines trial. A lot of clients use that. I did a trial and error process. And what they mean is they systematically investigated several alternatives, because the CRA defines trial and error as the opposite of what they're looking for. And I found even using those terms will tweak them off to come and do a site review. You never use the term trial and error in your project description. Okay? What we'll talk about now is some actual SR&ED projects that we're going to go through. One of the things I like to do is, I usually use a video, but we're gonna cut for a bit of time, is talk about the experimental process. And I like to use the example of Thomas Edison, who invented both the light bulb and perfected the light bulb and created the phonograph. And one of these, I would say, both were technological advancements, but one dealt with what we call scientific uncertainty. It was one of those eureka, never been done before moments, but it wasn't a great SR&ED project. So what we have is a picture of the phonograph, which was a wax tube that Thomas Edison spoke into. And his hypothesis was if he had a carbon filter with a pin, it would make indents on the wax tube, and he could play it back and hear it. And of course it worked, and they patented it the same day. So I'd say, well, as an SR&ED project, it had never been done before. He was the first ever recorded sound that we knew of. The hypothesis was to take this charcoal filter charcoal filter with a pin and to make the indents, and of course it worked, and they patented it the same day. So I'm saying from the idea he had this hypothesis at 9 a.m. till they patented it at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, him and 2 assistants, probably 20 man-hours. And that was it, and it was done. And that was the scientific eureka, groundbreaking advancement, which was kind of like more of an inspiration, I would call it, that proved to be successful. So technologically, it was a great SR&ED project, but dollar-wise, it was nothing. Okay? What I would say is most of the research and development that went into sound recording or reproduction came after this. Once people knew sound could be recorded, they said, hey, why put it on wax tubes? Why don't we flatten it? Why don't we spin it at different RPMs? Why don't we use lasers to read it? Why don't we do all kinds of things? So most of the money went to incrementally improving that existing Eureka technology, and that's usually the way it goes. Researchers often try to focus on the Eureka technologies because that's what the newspapers want to see. That's what's exciting. But again, that's really not the majority of the industrial R&D that we see every year. If we compare another one of Thomas's inventions, the light bulb, technically, he didn't really even invent the light bulb. There was patents for light bulbs years earlier. A fellow named Humphrey Davy actually created the electric arc about almost 80 years before Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. So these are around. There was 2 guys from Toronto who actually had patents on a light bulb. Woodward and Evans that Thomas Edison ultimately bought and used up. So what Thomas Edison did was he created the first commercially viable light bulb. A light bulb where the filament had a high resistance and a high melting point so that it would last a long time. And that's how he convinced Wall Street to put the money in, and the rest became history. Okay? So again, what people are famous for are often the Eureka moments, but most of the industrial R&D is the incremental improvements. And the people who commercialize it and put their name on it are usually the people who are remembered as the inventors, but are not often the actual inventors. All right. What I'm going to do before we jump into the actual project descriptions or examples right now is to look at something called the key criteria summary. So we're going to look at 4 different projects, and we're going to look at them from a high level, what we call a key criteria summary, and then we'll look a little more into the specifics of each project. Right? I've taken these projects from different areas, so those of you who've done this course in the past probably won't recognize any of these. What I'm planning to do, just to keep this course fresh each year, because I get tired of teaching 15 years in a row, is I'm going to switch the descriptions each year to match stuff that happened usually recently in a court case, or maybe throw a landmark court case in there, because those are usually pretty important to understand the whole system as well. So what I'm starting with here is a case from Montreal, and we'll talk in more detail, that was challenged by the CRA. And what happened was we had an inventor here who was an engineer who holds over 100 patents worldwide for different things. And he developed a new printer. And what this printer was it's miniature, and he wanted it to have better battery life and increased ability to feed pages through. And it was a little portable thing. So he had different criteria. And he talked about battery life and jam rates and working in different ambient humidities. So when the moisture got higher or colder, this paper would curl because it was a special kind of paper. He wanted to be able to handle different media thicknesses. He wanted a certain speed, 5 pages per minute, which is hard for a little battery-powered printer. He had different felt mediums that he wanted to last. So he had a lot of different objectives, right? He wanted reject rates, and he wanted overall cost of over $80. So that means he can't maybe use some of the higher-end components that a printer might otherwise use. Okay? And have a battery life of 20 pages, which was significantly more than what they could do right now. So stacking up all these objectives together, he felt that the variables in place were the clutch plate, how to make the clutch plate, and whether to use ridges, the anti-curl mechanism, how to design that to affect moisture, how to design the slip clutch, and how to handle static versus dynamic loads were some of the variables he mentioned as his experimentation. Okay? We're then told he did a fair amount of due diligence. He looked at patents, he looked at internet searches, he looked at competitive products, in-house technologies, all these things. He analyzed various methods, did different trials, and his costs looked reasonable. So at the end of the day, the judge not only ruled that it was in, but that, again, this would be exemplary of an SR&ED project. So again, this is indicative of, in the last few years, the Canada Revenue Agency has started to challenge projects that normally, like this one, I look at it and I say, wow, if this guy doesn't qualify, what really could be in? I'll jump ahead, but the position that the CRA took is, well, look, if you're such a brilliant engineer and you spend enough time, you can develop anything. So nothing is really SR&ED. And that's really the same position in Northwest Hydraulics. They'll say, come on, you guys are PhD professional engineers. There's nothing you can't figure out if you spend enough time. And that's true, but they've missed the whole point of the experimental development process. And as we said, the number of claims in this region are dropping off significantly. I've talked to claimants who just don't want to deal with it anymore. Guys who've claimed 8 or 10 years and all of a sudden got everything and all of a sudden they get nothing. And that's very commonplace now. So the whole system's in a bit of a state of flux right now in Canada. But in other countries, United States, UK, it's exploding. It's literally growing 25 to 30% a year. So I'm seeing practitioners from here, everyone's expanding their practices elsewhere. Okay, case of Northwest Hydraulics. So we talked about that. We're going to talk about it a little more. But in this case, again, they did background searches. They were looking at objectives that they were specific about. Decreasing bed load deposition, reducing downstream scouring, minimizing production costs. So again, they had the quantifiables in there. They talked about variables of uncertainty, structures, use of spurs, scour production seams, the geometry of the settling basin, different devices, weirs, sluiceways, headgates, ejectors. And they went on how a change in any one of these could affect the overall model and scheme, and that it wasn't readily predictable. Okay. At the end of the day, the judge again said this was exemplary of an SR&ED project, that it met all the clearly met all the criteria. He could not understand how the CRA could not see the technological advancement of that one. Okay, I've also included a software case. Software is a very tricky area, so what I thought I'd do is throw in some international guidelines from the OECD. We'll talk about them a little bit more. But they talk about things like levels of operating systems, programming languages, tools. When we get to those slides, I'll talk a little bit more about the generic things in software, the things that are typically eligible, let's say, and things that are typically ineligible. You still have to meet all the criteria, but it'll give you an idea of, is this an area that I should invest trying to do a description, or is this an area that's quite likely going to get shot down right from the start? And I find the CRA uses that kind of international guideline for its own review purposes. Okay? And then we'll look at a recent software case called Axis, where the company was developing a health record management system for Belize down in Central America. And the arguments there was they already knew how to do these distributed database systems, but the infrastructure and the communication structure was so weak down there that they had to develop new procedures for error checking or offline, or basically running parallel transactions where you may not have some information. Okay, so they had to develop structures and whatnot to do that, and they won. Okay. Now, one of the things that I'm not going to go in, but I've included in the course materials here, is back in 2004, as we mentioned, the Canada Revenue Agency had about almost 130 examples that were developed over a period of 20 to 25 years with industry, in various industries. And they erased them all at the end of 2012. And in late 2014, they came up with a set of 10 different, very brief examples. They're not meant to be whole projects. They're meant to illustrate specific points, according to the CRA. Now, I've listed them here for you more as a reference. So if you're doing work in that field, you probably want to go in and skim those, but they don't provide a lot of direction. Nonetheless, what I've found, and this is a little bit problematic, is that some reviewers, science reviewers from the CRA, when you ask them, you say, well, look, my client's got this case scenario, and there's actually a published case. Can we talk about the facts of Northwest Hydraulics or Axis and how they might parallel it? There's certain reviewers in CRA who won't let you do that. They say, no, I'm not going to talk about a tax court case. I don't care what the law says. It's almost contemptuous, really. They're saying, I won't let you use any evidence to defend your case. I'm only going to listen to what I want to say. And that's a point where, again, you may want to refer at least back to the CRA documents, because they're more likely to at least discuss one of their own documents than a tax court case, which some reviewers absolutely will not discuss any part of that, no matter what.